Young slave walks into master's office after hours. Then she said, "Promise you won't tell anyone." The wind rattled the shutters of Hawthorne Plantation as the storm rolled across the Georgia fields. Rain lashed against the windows of the grand house, turning the garden paths into rivers of mud. Candles flickered in the tall candelabras, casting trembling shadows across the polished wood of the master's office. Outside, the ancient oaks groaned under the storm's fury, their twisted limbs scratching at the night sky. Inside, the plantation felt hollow, the rooms echoing with the absence of its master, a cruel man more concerned with his land than the people who lived upon it. Clara Hawthorne, the young mistress of the estate, sat alone in her sitting room. Her hands, delicate and pale, twisted nervously in her lap. The fire in the hearth sputtered and died, leaving the room cold and shadowed. She had been restless all evening, her mind wandering down paths she would not have admitted to anyone, even to herself. The truth was unbearable. She was lonely, trapped in a marriage that offered her neither warmth nor comfort, and haunted by the creeping certainty that she would never bear a child. Her gaze drifted toward the hall, toward the office where her husband kept his ledgers and letters. She knew she had no reason to be there, yet some part of her ached for distraction, for the illusion of control in a world that felt increasingly foreign. That was when she saw him, Elijah, the young house slave, stepping quietly into the hall to retrieve the master's letters he had been ordered to file. He moved with a grace that seemed impossible for a man burdened by chains and toil. Elijah paused, sensing her presence, though he did not look directly at her. He was aware of the storm, of the wind that tossed the drapes like living things, of the rain that hammered against the roof. He was also aware of Clara's eyes, of the tension in the air, of the unspoken words that lingered between them. "You shouldn't be out here, Miss Clara," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the thunder. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, rising to her feet. Her dress whispered against the floorboards. I, I needed air. I needed to think." Elijah's eyes, dark and perceptive, studied her carefully. There was a flicker of concern in them, but also something else, something that both terrified and intrigued her. She had caught glimpses of it before. A sharp intelligence, a patience that belied his station, a depth of feeling that she suspected ran far deeper than loyalty alone. The storm made the room feel intimate, dangerous. The lightning cast fleeting illuminations, revealing the contours of her face, the curve of her neck, the restless tremor in her hands. Elijah felt a stir in his chest he could neither ignore nor indulge. He knew the boundaries of their world. Any act of closeness could be punished with severity. Any misstep could mean disaster. Yet the room between them was small, the storm outside relentless, and in that moment, the rules seemed suspended. "Shall I leave you to your thoughts, Miss Clara?" he asked, his hands folded in front of him, though his heart hammered against his ribs. She shook her head. "No. I. I want someone to talk to. Someone who understands. You understand, don't you?" Her voice was almost a whisper, fragile yet insistent. Elijah hesitated. He could not say that he understood, not fully. He had his own burdens, his own secret pains. And yet, he did understand loneliness. He understood isolation. He understood the fear of living a life dictated entirely by another's will. He stepped closer, careful to maintain the proper distance, aware of the electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the storm. "I'll listen," he said finally. "But you must promise me, Miss Clara. Promise you won't speak of this to anyone else." She nodded, relief and something heavier, something like anticipation, filling her chest. "I promise." For a long while, they spoke in murmurs, their words cautious and careful. Clara told him about the emptiness of the house, the weight of her husband's absence, the suffocating expectations of Southern society. Elijah listened, offering nothing but presence and a rare, considered insight. Occasionally, the candlelight caught his hand as he reached for a letter or a ledger, brushing accidentally against her fingers. Each touch was electric, a spark that neither could fully acknowledge, but both felt keenly. The storm intensified, shaking the windows, thrumming against the walls. Clara shivered, whether from the cold or something deeper she did not yet understand. Elijah, sensing her discomfort, moved a step closer, careful, deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. "You should sit," he said, gesturing toward a chair near the fire. "You'll catch your death standing there in this draft." She obeyed, the chair scraping softly against the wooden floor. He knelt briefly to light a candle closer to her, his hand brushing hers again. Neither spoke of the small, sharp thrill that shot through them. Minutes passed, the storm outside relentless, as their conversation deepened. Clara found herself revealing things she had never spoken aloud. Her fear of never becoming a mother, her growing distaste for the cruelty she witnessed on the plantation, her desire for someone, she could trust completely. Elijah's own heart twisted with desire and dread. He wanted nothing more than to hold her, to feel the warmth of her skin beneath his hands. Yet he knew that a single misstep could end both of their lives in ruin. And yet, he also understood the human need for connection, for understanding, for touch that promised safety, even if only for a fleeting moment. The thunder rolled again, closer now, rattling the glass and the floorboards. Clara's hand twitched in her lap. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and luminous. "Promise you won't tell anyone," she whispered again, the words carrying a weight that seemed almost sacred in the flickering candlelight. Elijah's jaw tightened. He nodded solemnly, feeling the gravity of her trust settle on his shoulders. "I promise." In that moment, the storm outside and the storm within the house seemed to merge. The boundaries of their world, the rules, the master's power, the ever-present threat of discovery, felt distant, as though suspended by some fragile, electric thread. And for the first time, Clara felt a dangerous hope, and Elijah a dangerous longing, intertwining them in ways that neither could yet name. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door behind him, startling them both. They froze, eyes locked, hearts pounding. Outside, the night was wild and unyielding, but inside, a new and more perilous storm had begun. Neither spoke, neither moved, and for a long, suspended moment, they simply existed in the charged silence between them, bound by fear, desire, and an unspoken understanding that nothing could ever remain the same. The next days were a torment to Clara. The house hummed with its usual rhythm, footsteps in the hall, the distant clatter of dishes, the low murmur of the slaves at work. But in her mind, she was caught in the storm that had begun the night Elijah had promised silence. She could not forget the way his eyes had lingered on her, the careful touch of his fingers brushing hers as he adjusted the candle, or the warmth of his presence in a room that otherwise felt so cold. Her husband, Jonathan Hawthorne, remained absent more often than not, returning only to eat hastily and give orders before disappearing into his study. He was a man of rigid habits and harsher temper, and Clara had long since learned to keep her emotions concealed behind a mask of proper composure. But with Elijah, there was no mask to wear. Even a fleeting glance could betray the tumult within her. Elijah, too, felt the weight of that night. Every day he moved through the halls and the fields aware of her presence, measuring his glances, his gestures, the subtle language of acknowledgement. He understood the dangers of their shared awareness. One misstep, a servant with a sharper tongue, a maid with jealousy, a glance from the master, and yet he could not erase the memory of the night storm, the candlelight, the whispered promise of secrecy. It was on the third evening after the storm, as twilight gave way to a drizzling rain, that fate, or perhaps misfortune, brought them together again. Clara had ventured to the wine cellar to retrieve a bottle for her husband's dinner, but the door, swollen from the rain, would not budge. The hinges creaked and groaned in protest, and she tugged with increasing frustration, shivering as the damp air seeped through her thin dress. "Elijah," she called softly, knowing she risked being overheard by a passing servant. Footsteps answered almost immediately. A shadow fell across the doorway, tall and solid, and then he was there, his dark eyes scanning the door before settling on her. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said, his voice low, carrying that familiar edge of caution. "The door, it's stuck," she murmured, teeth chattering slightly from the chill. I can't get it open. Elijah moved closer, his hand steady and sure as he grasped the warped wood, prying it gently until it gave way with a reluctant creak. His proximity made her breath catch, and she realized, with sudden clarity, how intensely aware she was of him, the curve of his jaw, the warmth radiating from his body, the subtle strength in his movements. "You're trembling," he observed, his voice softening, though she could sense the tension coiled beneath his words. Yes. It's cold," she said, aware that her explanation was feeble, that it covered something far more dangerous than mere temperature. He stepped back, giving her a moment to steady herself, but their eyes remained locked, and in the dim light of the cellar, she could see the faintest quiver in his hands, the unspoken acknowledgement of a shared thrill neither dared name. "You should not linger here," he warned, though his tone lacked the full force of reprimand. "If anyone saw—" "I know," she interrupted, almost breathless. I just needed to be somewhere away." For a heartbeat, they simply stood there, the storm outside a muted whisper of rain against stone walls. Then, impulsively, Clara took a step closer. She did not know why, only that some instinct urged her to bridge the distance between them, to feel that rare sense of understanding, of connection, that had first stirred during the candlelit night in the office. Elijah felt his pulse quicken. Every fiber of him screamed caution, yet every fiber also ached with the impossible longing she evoked. He wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, to close the space between them, but the memory of what could happen, the punishment, the ruin, kept him restrained. You should go back upstairs," he said finally, his voice strained, a fine tremor betraying his self-control. "I can't," she whispered, and in her eyes, he saw the storm of desire and despair, the lonely ache she could not voice aloud. He exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the drizzle falling against the cellar roof. "Then I will stay with you," he said quietly, not stepping forward, but simply remaining nearby, a presence that offered both danger and protection. They lingered there for what felt like hours. Clara spoke in fragments, sharing little secrets of the household, her frustrations, her fleeting fears about her barren womb, her husband's absence, the lonely ache that made the house feel like a prison. Elijah listened, offering small reassurances, his eyes never leaving hers, his voice a low murmur that seemed to echo softly against the stone walls. At one point, her hand brushed against his as she adjusted the candle. Neither pulled away. The contact, fleeting and innocent to any outsider, carried a charge neither could deny. A shiver ran through her, mirrored in the subtle stiffening of his muscles, and for a moment, the world outside, the rules, the master, the overseer, the other slaves, ceased to exist. A sudden sound, a creak of the steps above, perhaps a servant returning from the kitchen, sent them both flinching. Clara's heart leapt into her throat, and she stepped back, breaking the spell. "You should leave," she whispered, urgency lacing her words. "I will," Elijah said, but his gaze lingered, heavy with unspoken promise. "Soon, but not yet." Their eyes met, and in that charged moment, a silent agreement passed between them. They would find a way to meet again, secretly, though neither knew how often or how soon. The thrill of danger had ignited something neither could contain, a tension that simmered beneath the surface of their everyday lives. As he slipped quietly out of the cellar, leaving her alone among the barrels and the faint scent of oak and wine, Clara felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. She realized she was already longing for the next encounter, for the moments when the world could shrink to just the two of them, even if only for a few stolen breaths. Upstairs, she pressed her palms to her cheeks, trying to still the tremor that ran through her. She had never been so conscious of a single person's presence, so acutely aware of a body, a voice, a gaze. And yet, she knew that every glance, every touch, every shared secret carried peril. They were playing with fire. Elijah returned to his quarters in silence, but the memory of her warmth, the lightness of her breath, the unguarded way she had spoken to him, haunted him. He knew he was risking everything, that a single mistake could cost him his life. yet he could not extinguish the desire that flared like a candle in the storm. He replayed every detail of the cellar encounter in his mind, the way her hair fell across her face, the subtle curve of her lips as she spoke, the tremor in her hands, the trust implicit in her whispered plea. Promise you won't tell anyone. That night, both lay awake in their separate rooms, the storm still raging outside, their hearts echoing the rhythm of thunder and rain. Both understood, in ways they could scarcely admit, that their lives had changed irreversibly. The first meeting in the storm had been dangerous, the cellar encounter more so. Yet each had brought them closer, tethered them together by threads of longing, fear, and a shared recognition of solitude. And in that quiet, relentless storm, a forbidden connection began to grow. A connection neither could name aloud, but one that promised to upend their world entirely, if only they survived the peril that shadowed every stolen moment. The evening air was thick with humidity, the oppressive heat of late summer clinging to Clara's skin as she wandered the moonlit gardens alone. The fields glistened under the silvery light, the long shadows of oaks stretching across the grass like fingers. She had promised herself she would not venture out again, yet some irresistible pull led her toward the old carriage house at the edge of the property, a place she had long since deemed forbidden, where the scent of hay and oil mingled with the lingering memory of past storms. Elijah was already there when she arrived, his silhouette half hidden among the stacks of barrels and the shadowed beams of the structure. He had come to tend to the horses, checking their harnesses, yet the way he paused and turned as she approached made her heart leap. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, stepping from the shadows, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The night was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant croak of frogs in the marsh beyond. "I know," she said softly, pressing her fingers to her chest. I needed air. I needed somewhere to think." Elijah's gaze softened. "You are restless, Miss Clara. You cannot hide it, even behind your composed face." "I am lonely," she admitted, her voice barely more than a breath. She did not elaborate further. She did not need to. He understood. He had always understood. The carriage house was dimly lit by a single lantern Elijah had brought from the main house. Its warm, flickering glow carved shadows along the walls and floor, throwing shapes that seemed almost alive. Clara felt the closeness of him, the subtle warmth radiating from his body, and she could not stop the shiver that ran down her spine. "Come closer," he said finally, gesturing toward a worn bench near the stalls. "It is safer to speak from there." She obeyed, stepping lightly across the straw-strewn floorboards, careful not to disturb the sleeping horses. Her gaze lingered on him as she sat, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. There was a tension in the air between them, thick and charged, as if the night itself were holding its breath. Elijah took a seat opposite her, just far enough to respect propriety, but close enough that she could feel the heat of his presence. He looked at her steadily, reading the subtle cues of her body, the quickened pulse at her throat, the tremor in her hands. He understood the unspoken plea behind her wide, anxious eyes. Connection, comfort, understanding. "I should not feel this way," Clara whispered, her voice almost trembling. "It frightens me." "And yet you do," he replied softly, his dark eyes unwavering. "And so do I." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the tension between restraint and desire so palpable it seemed to thrum in the air. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to reach out, to close the space between them, yet she was painfully aware of the consequences. One wrong step, one overheard word, one careless glance from a passing servant, and everything could be lost. Elijah's hand twitched, as if drawn by the same invisible force that pulled her forward. Slowly, cautiously, he extended it, resting it just inches from hers on the rough wood of the bench. The nearness was electric. Clara's breath caught, and she dared to let her fingers brush against his, tentative and trembling. The contact, fleeting and gentle, was enough to ignite a fire within both of them. "You must not," he murmured, a shadow of warning in his tone. "If anyone saw—" "I know," she whispered, cutting him off. I want this." The honesty in her words, raw and unguarded, sent a thrill through him. He leaned just slightly closer, careful to maintain the delicate balance between desire and discretion. The scent of rain on the earth outside, mixed with the faint smell of his skin and the lantern's wax, was intoxicating. For a long, suspended moment, they simply existed in that space, connected by touch and breath, by the shared acknowledgement of feelings that neither could fully voice aloud. Clara's hand rested on his, a soft, fleeting weight, and Elijah felt a surge of something deeper than longing, something protective, something intimate, something terrifying in its intensity. Suddenly, a sharp sound, a branch scraping against the roof, perhaps, or a horse shifting in its stall, brought them both back to the reality of the night. Clara's pulse quickened. She pulled her hand back, fear mingling with desire, the thrill of danger almost unbearable. "You must go," she whispered, her voice strained. "I cannot. I know," he said quietly, his eyes locking on hers. "But I will see you again. Soon." Her lips parted, about to speak, but the words were lost. Instead, she nodded, her heart hammering, aware that this stolen moment had changed everything. The journey back to the house was a careful one, every shadow and sound scrutinized. Clara moved with heightened awareness, her senses alive to the risk that followed every step. In her chamber, she closed the door behind her and pressed her forehead to the cool wood. She was trembling, but not from fear alone. The encounter had left her breathless, awash in feelings she barely understood but could not deny. Elijah returned to his quarters, the memory of her hands, her gaze, the way she had leaned slightly toward him, searing in his mind. He knew that every meeting, every touch, every stolen word increased the peril. Yet, the need for connection, for understanding, for something human amid the cruelty of the plantation, outweighed caution in that moment. Over the next week, they found subtle ways to communicate, to meet briefly in hidden corners. A glance across the courtyard, a whispered word when passing in the hall, a shared task that allowed their fingers to brush. Each interaction built upon the last, layering desire and trust, tension and fear. The world of the plantation, the master, the overseer, the ever-watchful eyes of servants and slaves alike, was a constant threat, yet their longing continued to grow. One night, as a thunderstorm broke over the fields, Clara ventured again, this time to the slave quarters. She knew it was dangerous. The overseer often made rounds during storms, but the memory of Elijah's presence, the promise of understanding and solace, drew her irresistibly. She moved quietly, avoiding the watchful lamps along the paths until she reached a small clearing by the cabins. There he was, waiting. The rain slicked his dark hair to his forehead, his clothes damp, clinging to the lean strength of his frame. He looked at her, eyes wide, alert, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of risk and yet a surrender to the inevitability of their connection. "You shouldn't be here," he said, though his voice lacked its usual sternness. "I can't stay away," she whispered, the words trembling on her lips. He stepped forward, and she did not retreat. For a moment, the storm and the world beyond seemed to vanish. The rain fell around them, wild and unrelenting, and they existed only in that space, tethered together by the fragile thread of trust and desire. "Elijah," she murmured, her hand brushing against his once more. He caught it, holding it gently, reverently, aware that even this simple gesture was an act of rebellion. "I will protect you," he said, voice low, almost a vow. The storm intensified, thunder rolling across the fields, lightning illuminating the dark shapes of the cabins. Clara shivered, pressed close, their shared warmth a fragile shield against the world's cruelty. And in that moment, under the roar of the storm, the first true intimacy blossomed, a connection that was as emotional as it was physical, a promise without words, a desire tempered by fear, a bond that could either save or destroy them. They lingered until the storm passed, every sound of the night a reminder of their peril. When Clara finally slipped back into the shadows toward the house, her heart was heavy with longing and dread. knowing that each secret meeting deepened their connection, and with it, the stakes. Elijah watched her disappear into the night, rain dripping from her hair, the lanterns from the house casting faint light on her retreating figure. He knew that their bond was dangerous, that the plantation was unforgiving, that the master's cruelty could end them both. And yet, for the first time, he also knew something more powerful, that in Clara's presence, he felt alive, seen, and understood in ways he had never dared imagine. The storm left the night drenched and quiet, but the fire between them, dangerous, consuming, forbidden, burned brighter than ever. The summer air hung heavy over Hawthorne Plantation, thick with the scent of wet earth and blossoming jasmine. Even the nights felt oppressive, the humidity clinging to Clara's skin as she moved through the halls of the grand house, her mind restless. Her husband remained away on another of his business trips, leaving the estate in the care of his overseer, a sharp-eyed man who suspected more than he should. But Clara's thoughts were not on him. They were on Elijah. Since the storm in the carriage house and the night at the slave quarters, their stolen moments had become more frequent, more urgent. Every meeting was a delicate dance, a careful negotiation between desire and danger. Each glance in the hall, every whispered word in the kitchen, every brush of hands while performing chores carried a charge that neither could ignore. One evening, as twilight descended and the first hints of rain began to fall, Clara found herself drawn once again to the wine cellar. This time, she had a purpose beyond mere longing. Her husband's absence had left the household under the pretense of calm, and she had secretly taken to pouring wine for herself, not for indulgence, but as a small rebellion, a tiny assertion of freedom in a life otherwise constrained. Elijah was already there when she arrived, arranging bottles on the shelves with careful precision. The lantern cast warm, golden light, painting shadows that danced along the walls. He looked up, startled, but relief and a hint of suppressed excitement flickered across his face. "You came," he said, voice low, almost incredulous. "I had to," she admitted, closing the door behind her and pressing her back against it. "I cannot bear the days without seeing you." His eyes softened, and for a long moment, they simply regarded one another, the air between them thick with unspoken longing. Clara's heart raced, each beat echoing in her ears like a drum. She felt the risk in every second of their closeness, but also a need so deep it threatened to overwhelm her caution. "I should not be here," she whispered, the words trembling on her lips. "And yet, you are," he murmured, stepping closer, his presence a tangible warmth against the cool stone walls. His hand hovered near hers, just short of contact, testing the fragile barrier of propriety and fear. Clara's fingers twitched, drawn toward him as though by some invisible thread. I cannot stay away," she admitted, her voice barely more than a breath. Elijah exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the quiet of the cellar. He reached out, just enough to let their fingers brush, tentative and trembling. The touch, simple and fleeting, was enough to ignite a current between them, electric and undeniable. Clara shivered, leaning slightly closer, and he felt the subtle warmth of her body, the gentle rise and fall of her chest. "Clara," he began, his voice husky, but she cut him off with a soft shake of her head. I only want to be near you," she whispered. "To feel that you understand." He nodded, his own longing mirrored in the intensity of his gaze. "I understand, more than you know." They lingered in silence, the only sound the gentle drip of water from the cellar ceiling and the faint rustle of bottles on the shelves. The moment stretched, fragile and potent, each second a mixture of pleasure and peril. Clara felt the heat of his hand near hers, the brush of his fingers as he reached to steady a bottle, and a wave of emotion crashed over her. Fear, desire, hope, and a dangerous thrill of rebellion. Suddenly, a distant footstep on the stairs startled them both. Clara's heart leapt into her throat. Elijah's eyes darkened with warning. He moved instinctively, placing himself slightly in front of her, shielding her from view. "Stay close," he whispered, the edge of authority in his tone impossible to ignore. Clara pressed herself against the wall, trembling as the footsteps drew nearer. The overseer's silhouette appeared in the doorway, lantern in hand. Elijah's presence must have gone unnoticed, for the man's gaze passed over them without suspicion, muttering something about the approaching storm. Once the overseer moved on, Elijah let out a quiet sigh of relief. "That was too close," he murmured, turning to her. "You must be more careful. Each time you risk more than you know." "I know," she said softly, though she could not suppress the thrill that ran through her veins. "But I cannot stop myself." Their closeness grew, each encounter peeling back layers of fear and restraint. Clara began to notice the subtleties in Elijah's expression, the flicker of worry when she lingered too long in a hallway, the brief tightening of his jaw when the master's absence became prolonged, the quiet sighs when he imagined a world in which they were free. And he noticed the way her eyes softened when she looked at him, the nervous tremor in her hands, the barely perceptible leaning toward him when she thought no one was watching. The storm that followed was fierce, rain pounding against the windows, wind rattling the shutters. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cellar in stark, fleeting brilliance. Clara pressed closer to Elijah, the small space of the cellar becoming their secret world, a sanctuary from the rules, the cruelty, and the ever-present danger outside. They spoke of things they had never dared voice. Clara's doubts about the morality of the plantation, the oppressive weight of her husband's authority, the loneliness that had defined her existence. Elijah spoke in quiet, measured words about his own life, his fears, and the impossible longing for freedom, for dignity, for a life that seemed unattainable. In the flickering light, their hands found one another again, this time resting together, fingers intertwined in a gesture that was both innocent and charged. Clara leaned forward slightly, her lips trembling as if to speak, yet she did not. The moment was sacred, fragile, and forbidden. And then, without warning, the cellar door creaked again. Both froze. The sound of a servant returning from the kitchen echoed in the stone walls. Elijah's body tensed, protective instinct overriding every other thought. He moved slightly to shield Clara, and the servant's lantern light passed them by without suspicion. The danger was immediate, palpable, and their hearts pounded in synchrony. When the coast was clear, they exhaled together, laughter mingled with relief, though their eyes remained locked in silent understanding. "Each time we meet," Elijah whispered, "we risk everything." "I know," Clara said, voice trembling. "And yet I cannot stay away." He drew a shallow breath, his fingers tightening around hers. "Nor can I." The storm outside waned, leaving the night damp and quiet. Yet within the cellar, a new storm raged, a storm of longing, trust, fear, and forbidden desire. Each encounter, each brush of hands, each whispered confession bound them closer, creating a secret world that neither could abandon. As they left the cellar separately, Clara returned to her chamber, wet from the rain, trembling with a mixture of excitement and terror. Elijah returned to the quarters, his mind replaying every detail, the scent of her hair, the warmth of her touch, the intensity in her eyes. They both knew that their bond was dangerous, that the plantation would not forgive indiscretion, yet they also knew it was irreversible. That night, as Clara lay in her bed, staring at the darkened ceiling, she whispered into the darkness, "Promise me, we will find a way." And far away, in the slave quarters, Elijah held her words close, a vow unspoken yet understood. He would protect her, no matter the cost, and he would not let the world crush the fragile, forbidden connection they had forged in the storm. The oppressive heat of late summer had given way to the first chill of autumn, yet the nights at Hawthorne Plantation remained suffocating with tension. Clara paced her chamber, the candlelight flickering across her face, her thoughts a whirl of longing, fear, and recklessness. Her husband had been away for days, and the household had quieted to the point where every creak of the floorboards echoed like a warning. Yet she could not stay still. She could not stop thinking about Elijah. He had been with her in her mind constantly, the warmth of his hand in hers, the subtle strength of his presence, the unspoken promises that lingered between every stolen glance. And now, She knew she needed more than words and fleeting touches. She needed a connection that defied the constant danger surrounding them. The rain began again that evening, gentle at first, then heavier, drumming on the shutters like a call she could not resist. Clara moved silently through the house, avoiding the glow of the overseer's lanterns and the occasional passing servant. Her destination was the barn at the far edge of the property, a place that had become their secret refuge during storms, a space away from prying eyes where they could speak, touch, and exist as themselves, if only for a few precious hours. Elijah was already there, tending to the horses, his movements calm and controlled, yet his eyes lit up the moment he saw her. The shadows of the barn enveloped them, the smell of hay and earth mixing with the faint tang of rain on the wooden beams. "You shouldn't be out here," he whispered, his voice low, almost hoarse. "The overseer, he—" "I know," Clara interrupted, stepping closer. Her dress was damp from the rain, clinging to her skin, and she shivered not from cold but from anticipation. "But I had to see you." He studied her for a long moment, weighing the danger against the longing in her eyes. Slowly, he closed the distance, standing just a few feet away, the space between them charged with unspoken desire. "You could be punished," he murmured, his voice taut with tension. "I could be punished. And yet—" Clara took a step closer, the lantern light catching her wet hair and pale skin. "And yet, I cannot stay away. Neither can you." He exhaled, the sound a mixture of relief and warning. "No," he admitted, "I cannot." For the next few hours, the barn became their world. They spoke in whispers, their voices blending with the sound of the storm outside. Clara revealed her deepest fears, the emptiness of her marriage, her struggle to conceive, and the growing revulsion she felt at the cruelty around her. Elijah shared his own burdens, the constant vigilance, the fear of punishment, the dream of freedom, and the impossible longing he felt for her. Their hands found each other again, lingering longer than before. Each touch was a defiance of the world that sought to keep them apart. Each brush of fingers a promise and a rebellion. The storm outside seemed to mirror their own tumultuous emotions, thunder shaking the roof as if echoing their hearts. "You must promise me something," Clara said, her voice trembling, the candlelight reflecting in her wide eyes. "Promise that, if we are discovered, you will survive. You must escape if it comes to that." Elijah's jaw tightened. The thought of leaving her behind was unbearable, yet he knew the plantation would not forgive their defiance. "I promise," he said quietly, "but I will not leave you willingly. Not if I can help it." The intensity of their connection grew, each stolen glance, each whispered word, each trembling hand pushing them further toward a boundary neither dared to cross fully. And yet, the fear of discovery hung over them like a shadow. Every creak of the barn, every distant step on the path outside, made their hearts pound in synchrony. As the storm reached its peak, Clara leaned closer, her lips hovering near his in a fleeting, suspended moment. Elijah's hand lifted to brush her hair from her face, and for a heartbeat, the world outside ceased to exist. Lightning flashed, illuminating their entwined figures against the backdrop of the barn, and the thunder rolled like a drum of warning. A sudden noise, a snapped branch, a shout from the overseer, a startled horse, shattered the fragile bubble of intimacy. They froze, eyes wide, breath caught in their throats. The risk was immediate, tangible, and horrifying. "Go," Elijah whispered, his voice strained. Before someone sees you." Clara hesitated, torn between fear and longing. Finally, she nodded, retreating into the shadows toward the main house, her heart pounding so fiercely she thought it might burst. Elijah watched her disappear, his body tense, every nerve alert. He knew that each encounter increased the danger, that the next time might not end safely. That night, Clara lay in her bed, wet from rain and trembling from desire and fear, staring at the dark ceiling. Her mind was a storm of longing, uncertainty, and dangerous hope. She had come to realize that her feelings for Elijah were no longer fleeting. They had grown into something irrevocable, something that defied the rules of their world. "Elijah," In his quarters, replayed every detail of the barn encounter. The warmth of her hand, the softness of her voice, the intensity of her gaze, they haunted him, fueling both his longing and his dread. He knew the plantation was merciless, that a single mistake could mean death or punishment for them both. Yet he also knew that the thought of living without her was a torment greater than any physical danger. Over the following days, they planned cautiously. Whispers, glances, brief touches, all calculated to avoid suspicion, became their language. Yet the thought of escape began to take root in their minds. The dream of freedom, of running north together, tantalized them, but it was fraught with danger. Each plan, each possibility, carried the risk of discovery and punishment. One evening, under the cover of a new storm, Clara met Elijah in the fields beyond the old oak tree that had long marked the boundary between cultivated land and wild woods. The rain fell in sheets, soaking them both, and the wind bent the branches into shapes that seemed to reach for them. They spoke quickly, urgently, voices low against the roar of the storm. "If we run," Clara whispered, "we cannot wait. We must leave before he returns." "I know," Elijah replied, his eyes dark and resolute. "I have thought of nothing else. But the risk, if we are caught—" "I would rather risk it," she said fiercely, her hand gripping his, "than live without you." For a brief, perfect moment, they allowed themselves to imagine freedom, to imagine a life where their bond was no longer forbidden, where love was not a crime. And yet, as lightning split the sky and thunder shook the earth, reality intruded. The world of the plantation, the master, the overseer, the ever-present danger, was inescapable. They parted that night with a silent understanding. One more meeting, one more chance to plan, and then the ultimate choice, flight or ruin. Their hearts were bound together in ways that no law, no master, no threat could sever, yet the cost of their connection loomed larger with every stolen touch, every whispered word, every rain-soaked embrace. And so the storm passed, leaving the night drenched and heavy, but the fire between them, dangerous, consuming, forbidden, burned brighter than ever, signaling the imminent climax of a love that could either triumph in freedom or be extinguished in tragedy. The night was thick with fog and the scent of rain-soaked earth. Hawthorne Plantation seemed to hold its breath, the usual sounds of crickets and distant animals muted under the heavy weight of storm clouds. Clara lay awake in her chamber, staring at the dark ceiling, her mind consumed with the memory of Elijah, the warmth of his hands, the quiet intensity of his gaze, the reckless courage that had drawn her to him time and again. Tonight, she knew, was the night they had to decide. Run or remain trapped in a world that sought to crush their love. Elijah was waiting, as they had agreed, near the edge of the fields, under the protective cover of the old oak tree. The rain had softened to a drizzle, leaving the ground slick and muddy, the smell of wet grass mingling with the faint tang of iron from the nearby creek. His figure was barely visible in the dim light, but the moment Clara saw him, her heart leapt, both with longing and dread. "You came," he whispered, his eyes scanning the shadows for threats. "I had to," she replied, breathless. "Tonight we leave. Or we try." He nodded, the tension in his shoulders evident. "If we are caught." His voice faltered, but Clara placed a hand over his, steadying him, grounding them both in the gravity of the moment. "We will not be caught," she said firmly, though doubt lingered in her mind. "We know the risks. We've planned as best we can." For a few minutes, they moved silently through the wet fields, careful to avoid the lanterns of the overseer and the occasional passing worker. Every step was a careful negotiation with danger. Every shadow could conceal an enemy, every snap of a twig could signal discovery. Yet the storm seemed to shield them, the rain a curtain between them and the cruel world of the plantation. Finally, they reached the edge of the property, where the forest loomed dark and protective. Here, the real challenge began, navigating the wilderness, staying ahead of pursuit, and surviving long enough to taste freedom. Clara looked at Elijah, the fierce determination in his eyes matching her own. I never thought I could feel so alive," she whispered, her fingers intertwined with his. "Nor I," he replied, voice low. "Nor I. But we must go now. There's no turning back." They plunged into the woods, the mud sucking at their shoes, the branches lashing at their skin. The storm had left the ground treacherous, yet every obstacle seemed trivial compared to the fire burning between them. For the first time, the weight of the plantation, the cruelty, the isolation, the ever-present threat of death, felt distant. Here, in the darkness, with their hands clasped and hearts pounding, they were free in spirit, if not yet in body. And then, the inevitable happened. A shout rang out, sharp and urgent, followed by the heavy pounding of boots against sodden earth. The overseer had realized something was amiss. Clara's stomach dropped, terror crashing through her as adrenaline surged. Elijah gripped her hand tighter, eyes scanning for escape routes. "This way," he hissed, pulling her deeper into the forest. Branches tore at their clothes, mud coated their skin, and the sound of pursuit grew louder. Clara's lungs burned, her legs trembling with exhaustion, yet she refused to let go. She could not. Not now. Not after everything. Suddenly, Elijah stumbled, caught on a hidden root, and Clara nearly fell with him. The shout from the overseer was closer now, and Clara felt the weight of reality pressing down. They had dreamed of freedom, but the plantation would not relinquish its hold so easily. "Elijah!" she cried, fear breaking through her resolve. He turned, eyes dark with both desperation and calculation. "Go! Go without me," he shouted. "I will hold them off. I swear it." "No!" Clara screamed, tears mingling with the rain. "I will not leave you." But he shook his head fiercely. "You must, for both our sakes. Run, Clara, run!" Her heart tore in half as she realized the truth. The love that had bound them together was now the very thing that threatened to destroy them. Reluctantly, she let him push her forward, forcing her body to move even as every fiber of her being screamed to stay. She ran blindly, the forest a blur, the sounds of pursuit fading behind her. Her tears soaked her cheeks, her chest heaving, her mind caught between terror and grief. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the trees thinned, revealing the edge of a distant road. Freedom, tantalizing and fragile, stretched out before her, but at what cost? Behind her, the sounds of the plantation were swallowed by the night. Elijah's sacrifice had bought her this chance. She stumbled to a halt, gasping, and pressed a trembling hand to her chest. The wind carried a distant shout, the echo of his bravery, and her heart ached with the knowledge that she might never see him again. Hours later, Clara reached the river that marked the first step of her journey north. She paused, hands gripping the muddy banks, looking back into the dark forest where Elijah had disappeared. The storm had passed, leaving the night calm but heavy with the weight of loss. She whispered his name into the quiet, the words almost swallowed by the wind. "I will find a way back," she promised softly, though the reality of the world made her words fragile. "I swear it." In the distance, the lights of the plantation were barely visible, like ghosts of the life she had left behind. Every memory, the candlelit cellar, the storm-soaked barn, the old oak tree, the whispered promises, pressed against her heart. She had survived, but the cost of survival was the absence of the one she loved most. And Elijah, her heart knew, even without sight or sound, that he had faced the plantation, stood against its cruelty, and made the ultimate choice to protect her. She would carry that sacrifice always, the memory of his strength and love etched into her soul. As the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, Clara prepared to leave the riverbank, to follow the distant roads that promised freedom. Her body ached from exertion, her spirit from grief, yet something resilient burned within her. The fire of love, courage, and hope. The world had tried to claim them, to crush their bond, yet she carried the memory of their connection like a secret talisman, guiding her forward. The story of Clara and Elijah did not end in certainty. The plantation remained, cruel and unyielding, and the night had shown that love, no matter how fierce, could demand the ultimate sacrifice. Yet in the echo of storm and forest, In the memory of stolen touches and whispered words, there remains something unbroken, something eternal. Clara's footsteps faded along the muddy path, each one carrying the weight of love and loss, courage and hope. And somewhere, in the shadowed forest, Elijah endured, his own heart bound to hers across the miles of night and fear. Their story, forbidden and dangerous, would live on in memory, in longing, and in the impossible hope of reunion, an open-ended testament to love that dared to defy the world. The storm had passed. The plantation slumbered, oblivious. And yet, the fire they had ignited could never be quenched.